in the Supplemental Environmental Projects webinar. A few housekeeping items. We will be recording this webinar and we'll make it available on the NCTCOG TMDL website along with the presentation. We will be taking questions in the chat box throughout the webinar. However, we will not be answering any of those questions today due to some staff changes over at TCEQ, but we will post all of the answers to the questions that are asked in the chat box on the TMDL website upon the conclusion of this webinar. So today, our presenter is Ryan Rutledge, the Supplemental Environmental Projects Attorney with the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. Ryan Rutledge was born and raised in Mission, Texas. After high school, he attended the University of Texas at San Antonio and graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice in May of 2005. In 2008, Ryan received his Doctor of Jurisprudence from the University of Texas at Austin School of Law and has been a staff attorney with the TCEQ since 2012. Although Mr. Rutledge enjoys residing in Buda, Texas, he does not particularly enjoy the I-35 work commute. Ryan is married and has a lovable cat. Fun fact, Ryan got married the same day that he got his bar results. So at this point, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ryan. And like I said, if you guys have any questions at any time, please enter them into the chat box, and we'll be sure to answer them after the conclusion of the webinar. Ryan?
Yes, thanks, Hannah. So this is Ryan Rutledge over here at TCEQ. So most of my work is actually in the litigation division, representing the executive director in enforcement cases, but a portion of my work is to draft contracts and negotiate contracts for potential third-party administrators for purposes of the Supplemental Environmental Project, or the C-SEP program. When we're fully staffed, it's one part-time C-SEP attorney, which is me, two C-SEP coordinators, and then of course we have a supervisor that we work through as well. What I wanted to have an opportunity to do is kind of give a broad overview of the C-SEP program. A lot of the information is going to be about respondents, which at first blush doesn't seem, it kind of seems out of place, but it is important to kind of know like where the money comes from. As it'll be pointed out, the C-SEP program is not a grant program, as many of you know, and so it is kind of important to know, like, how does the process work? How do we get funding, and then how do people get added to the list in order to be a possible candidate to receive said funding from respondents and their settlement agreements, such as they are. So that's what we'll kind of try and cover. First slide is the link that, and incidentally, the PowerPoint presentation, Hannah has a copy of. Anyone who wants a copy of it, they'll be able to gain access to it and have access to the hyperlinks and everything that you'll see today. There's a lot of very detailed information and forms through this link that you see here with important C-SEP information. So I would highly encourage you to kind of, after the presentation at your leisure, to kind of click through there and see if that might actually answer some, if not most of your questions. If you see here, we're going to discuss C-SEP offsets, the program in general, types of C-SEPs. We will get the third-party administrator information, and then contact information and other kind of key data points that are kind of will make sense in the context of what we talk about. So respondent is an entity that is in violation of a TCEQ rule or rules or Texas law. Respondent is an entity regulated by the TCEQ, including individuals, governments, and nonprofits. So say, for instance, you're a public water system and you meet the definition of a PWS. Gas stations, I happen to personally work on a lot of what's called petroleum storage tank cases. So gas stations that have regulated fuel in their tanks and underground storage tanks and things of that nature. Any kind of regulated entity that, for one reason or another, it gets violations cited against them and then decides to either settle the case or even go through a contested case hearing. We call those respondents. And of course, one of the ways, the vast majority of the time, is when we settle cases through an agreed order. That's the vehicle by which it doesn't always have to have a supplemental environmental project or a C-SEP attachment A attached to it, but we do encourage that. And of course, some types of respondents, which you'll see shortly, are more inclined to use the C-SEP as an offset than others. And that will make sense when we get through to type of local governments. So an environmental enhancement project that it offsets an administrative penalty in an enforcement matter. Offset being the operative term here. So It doesn't make the penalty amount go away. The penalty is designed by, we have to follow the penalty policy approved by the commission, but it will offset a percentage of that penalty so that depending on what type of SEP the respondent is doing, they may be able to offset a proportion or in certain circumstances, the entirety of the penalty in lieu of doing a type of SEP, which we'll get to shortly. And there's qualifications for each of those. The purpose of the SEP is to prevent pollution, reduce the amount of pollutants reaching the environment, enhance the quality of the environment, and contribute to public awareness of environmental matters. These are not really designed to be mutually exclusive. And in fact, as will be demonstrated later in the presentation, like for instance, you couldn't do a SEP that's just educational in nature. There could be an educational component to it, say tire pickup. If there's trash or tire cleanup on a property, you can have an educational component designed around that, but there would actually have to be a measurable environmental benefit to the SEP program. And in some instances, that's not always clear that some people want to do educational programs or open up centers for educational purposes exclusively, and that unfortunately those based on what the statute requires, it does require a measurable benefit. Violation media, the SEP media, they're broken up into air, water, and waste, and that's important because if you're a respondent and you decide to do a settlement with TCEQ and participate in the SEP program in some capacity, the nature of your violation will determine where that portion of the funds are going to go to. Would it be eligible for air, water, or waste? In some instances, there might be multimedia type of violations. It could be both waste, water, and waste. And so they could actually technically choose a third party that performs either water or waste types of SEP programs. In some very, very unique instances, predominantly air violators might be able to also contribute to an air/water SEP, but those are very, very rare. So here are the projects that benefit the community in which the alleged violation occurred. So this is what we mean by that. There's levels of community, as you can see from this slide here. So what the intention is if you're a respondent who violates and enters this SEP agreement, we try and target, we focus narrowly, and then we can branch out if need be. We try and benefit the local community first, if that's a possibility, and then if there's an opportunity or a lack of opportunity on that level, we can move up a little to the county level or the river basin, depending if it's a water quality, aquifer, or air region control. And these maps will kind of give you an idea. You can take a look at these at your leisure. They're very, very helpful. As it stands, like you would, if you were in El Paso, you would and had water quality violations, you would, at a minimum, your SEP would, as a respondent, your SEP would be beneficial to, at most, the river, somewhere, a community somewhere in the river basin region that you're a community part of, as opposed to trying to do something in Nacogdoches, if you're in El Paso. Here's another, the aquifer zones, and there's the air quality control regions. For air violators, they would go community, city, county, and then, but if push came to shove, we would at a minimum try and at least get it within the control region that they're a part of. So if they're out of DFW, they would be in air control region 210. So we talked about SEP offset. So respondent may perform or contribute to a SEP in lieu of paying an assessed penalty to the General Revenue Fund. So they earn the credit by performing a compliance or custom SEP, and we'll discuss the differences of those shortly, or contributing to a third-party administrator SEP. They do not reduce the penalty amount, and they are not grants. And we always have to put that in bold and exclamation points. I'm sure by now most people are aware of this, but you still get confusion that there's, like CDBG or some of those, like the SEP program is a grant program where there's just kind of a pool of money, and that's not the case. Money comes in as the respondents settle their cases, and then if they choose to do a third-party SEP, then they would contribute off of the ones that are on that list, and that would, go to the benefit of whatever the approved project for that third-party administrator would be. These are the types of organizations we see, obviously for-profit, your typical corporations and individuals, and then your local governments, or LGs for short, and nonprofits. The environmental benefit of direct, indirect, or mixed, that used to have a little bit more meaning back when there was not as much participation in compliance SEPs as there is now, and I'll explain why that's the case. And that does have an impact, incidentally, on funding availability for, say, third-party administrators now as opposed to, say, even 7 years ago. Typically, in nearly all cases, we have direct benefit projects. An indirect or mixed would have like an educational component to it, would be the easiest example. Those are some of the percentage offsets. These are important. If you look at the direct benefit, you'll notice that's the one with the distinction between a corporation as opposed to a nonprofit or government, where the SEP offset can be 100% direct benefit, and that's through compliance SEPs, which we'll discuss. So these are the three types. There's the compliance SEP, or C-SEP for short. That's for local governments only. Custom SEP is any respondent, but for reasons I'll explain, custom SEPs are extraordinarily rare. They can cost a lot, usually more than the actual fine or penalty that they would have, and it has a very quick timetable for completion, which is usually not very attractive for a respondent. And of course, there's the very common pre-approved or contribution. The Commission may consider a respondent's willingness to contribute to a SEP that is approved by the Commission. Those are the third-party SEPs, giving preference to projects that benefit the community in which the alleged violation occurred. The Commission may not approve a project that is necessary to bring a respondent into compliance with the environmental laws or necessary to remediate environmental harm caused by the respondent's alleged violations, with an exception. That's the compliance SEP. So the Commission may approve a SEP project that is necessary to bring a respondent into compliance with alleged violations if the respondent is an LG, a local government. These are a list of local governments that are defined in the Texas Water Code. So what this allows, the theory that the Texas legislature operated on was, a few years ago, they allowed 100% offset for local governments, so that instead of paying, let's say, a $50,000 penalty, they're still on the hook for $50,000, but they could use the $50,000 to put back into their system to, usually it's, let's say, water quality issues, or maybe they're having effluent exceedances, non-human error type problems, in which they just need to fix it, the infrastructure, and then theoretically not have any more violations. The idea being that, we wanted to encourage local governments, especially, smaller towns and where they might be more the more likelihood of aging infrastructure with a small tax base, where a $50,000 penalty might be quite burdensome to the local tax base. And so instead of forcing an LG to pay both the penalty and an additional cost just to get back into or return to compliance, they could use the penalty amount that they would otherwise send to the General Revenue Fund to 100% with approval, with TCQ's approval, to 100% do a compliance SEP and use those resources to fix their problem and then return to compliance, and hopefully, not be, have a problem with the enforcement division or their region, depending on where the investigation came from. Now, as you might imagine, that has an impact, or it did definitely have an impact on the amount of resources available to third parties, for instance, because in the past, that option wasn't really available to for 100% offset for LGs, and so they might choose, instead of a compliance SEP, they might choose a third-party SEP in which the portion of the funds would be paid in penalty form to the general revenue, and then a portion, of course, go to the third-party administrator of their choosing. But now, with this as an option, with some caveats, which we'll discuss, it's very popular for obvious reasons. They would rather use the resources to fix their problem than to choose someone off the third-party administrator list. The two paths of a C-SEP is automatic or financially qualified, formed by the respondent as part of a TCQ agreed order. And then there would have to be a need for corrective action. They couldn't have fixed their problem after the fact, but before the settlement. The idea being that they knew of the problem, they fixed it, and then they got hit by a violation. It's like, well, if the problem was fixed before a notice of enforcement was issued, it's difficult to justify allowing them to have an offset when they've kind of already spent their money and fixed the problem. Very few circumstances where there's a timing issue, we do at least consider, them making the case on whether or not they can get compliant C-SEP under those circumstances, but that doesn't happen very often. So the LG, the local government, has not previously committed a violation at the same site with the same underlying cause in the preceding 5 years as documented in the TCQ order, and did not agree before the date the Commission initiated the enforcement action to perform the project. So basically what that means is if they couldn't have already been planning to fix these things and fix them either through another, maybe in concert with another governmental agency, and then try and basically double dip. That's the point for the second thing. And then for the first point, where it's not a get out of jail free card where they can just continue to violate over and over again. You can do it once, okay, let's figure out what we need to do to get back into compliance. But if they still have the same problem, if, like, say, for instance, if the exact same issue happens within 3 years of the previous order, they're not automatically eligible for an automatic C-SEP. So that's to prevent them from basically taking advantage of the compliance SEP purpose, which is hopefully to fix the problem and keep it fixed. Financially qualified C-SEP, these are very, very rare. They almost are always automatic C-SEPs. The scenarios have always, they just lend themselves that there's never been, like, there's very rare instances where there's repeat violators that don't meet the qualifications of the automatic C-SEP. But they're in the instance where they might not, the statute does allow for this process. They have to go through the financial administration division, and that's kind of out of my wheelhouse, but I think maybe one time in the years that I've been here, has that review even been requested. So this is C-SEPs, common kind of programs, repair structures or equipment, or remediate environmental harm caused by the LG's alleged violations, such as cleanup or spill. What it doesn't cover, if there was just flat out human error, that wouldn't be covered under a C-SEP. So this is the custom SEP, is the second type of SEP that I think there's been 2 in the last 5 or 6 years. They're extraordinarily rare. They're not particularly popular for the reasons I had kind of alluded to earlier. They are performed by the respondent as part of a TCQ agreed order. Projects most considered are direct benefit projects because they're easier to understand and track, and they're easier for the respondent to actually come up with, because they're the ones that actually kind of ginning up this project proposal for us to do. And there are a few, the couple that we do have are very, very uncomplicated and have very, very easy tracking. And of course, like I mentioned, they have to be complied with within 365 days from the effective date of the order. What that means is from the date that the Commission actually approved the order, which could be months after the drafting of the settlement agreement and the signing of it. They could start at any point, but they don't have to wait until it's, in fact, it's encouraged for them not to wait for it to get approved by the Commission, but it can be a quick turnaround, which is probably why it's not used very often. Failure to complete a custom SEP will result in the respondent paying the entire assessed penalty in addition to whatever funds were spent on the project. And custom SEPs, as I mentioned before, usually cost more than the assessed penalty. SEPs must be accepted prior to any feasibility study or budgeting, planning, or implementation. You can do basic information gathering. These are types of custom SEPs. The ones that we do get are the collection events, where there's at no cost to citizens. There's the used tire pickup, the electronics. You probably maybe even as a citizen participated in some of these collection events. Erosion control, there's a kind of an asterisk next to that. Beautification and flood control projects are not considered erosion control projects. That's one we've seen in the past where they try and do tree bedding and stuff of that nature. In and of itself, it's usually not considered erosion control projects for this purpose, but it's been quite a while since we've gotten even so much as a proposal for those types of projects. It's usually collection events. Typical reporting documents, and this is really important for compliance and custom SEPs. Itemized list of expenses, paid receipts, the work logs, maps showing the location of the project, dated photographs covering the entire length of the project, and of course, certified notarized quantifiable environmental benefit. Needs to be measurable environmental benefit. And this would be for obvious reasons. We would need to track to make sure that they did, in fact, the respondent did, in fact, provide everything we needed to show that they used the SEP offset to the benefit of the project that they proposed. These reporting requirements are also important for third-party administrators. As we'll see shortly, there's the transparency requirement is just as important on the third-party side as it is on the respondent side. SEPs will not cover administrative costs or organizations' operating costs. Again, we're talking about the respondent side right now. Reporting expenses, liability, project coordination, equipment breakdown, things of that nature. These were some of the collection events that Bryony would have, I'm sure, told a very interesting tale about. But, you know, unfortunately, she's still with the agency, but she moved on to a different position. But they're kind of self-explanatory. They're trying to pick up tires or those old CRT monitors that weigh 300 pounds. This was a wastewater project. Some of the projects in the past had been for communities that are operating off of old OSSFs to kind of go in and fix, and for low income, kind of fix their local infrastructure. These are some of the before and after pictures. Third-party administrator SEPs, I promised we would have get to these. They're performed by a local government or a nonprofit organization that has a SEP agreement with TCEQ. They're called third-party administrators once they're approved. Types of third-party SEPs are cleanup projects, like collection events, air projects, the most popular being the school bus replacement program. There are a few energy efficiency upgrade projects and a few air monitoring networks. Those are too familiar with those, but Bryony, I know, works with or worked with the air monitoring and projects, especially around the Houston and Dallas area, possibly one in the Valley. And of course, your water quality projects for wastewater and drinking water assistance for low-income households. I think one of the examples was above. And water quality monitoring. The habitation, restoration, preservation, and acquisition projects, that would be like projects where they're getting easements or purchasing land for purposes of habitat restoration and native species protection and invasive species eradication. Those are very common. We have several of those. They do take a long time to do, but those can be done in phases. So, you know, you could hire someone out there to do a site assessment, and those are kind of popular to do when they have resources because they're able to kind of check off boxes in certain phases, as opposed to, say, like the school bus replacement. Well, you have to wait until you get fully funded to buy that bus. It's not like you can do that in phases and buy like a part of it and put it together over a course of time. Depending on the project description of the third party has in mind, some of these types of projects may be more attractive than others. And that also depends on how much funding you anticipate getting from other sources, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So the LG or nonprofit organization submits an application to become a third-party administrator. This is where I come in. I receive those applications. It says TCEQ reviews. That's me, and it's only me. And again, most of my work is actually in enforcement cases. So it is a first in, first out basis. When I get an application, I'm very, very straightforward. I want to make sure that I have a completed application. The application itself, if it references information that I think should be an attachment, I ask for that. I want to make sure that when I sign it into the queue that I at least have a completed application so that when I do get to it, which could be, and this is usually projected, it could take anywhere from 6 to 12 months for an application to get reviewed and potentially approved. Depending on the complexity of the project, there can be a lot of back and forth between the prospective third-party administrator and TCEQ staff. Once the project is approved, though, there is the details of the project, an estimated budget, and allowable costs. For preference for direct, we do have a preference for direct benefit SEPs. They're actually on both sides beneficial because they're easier to describe to the TCEQ and for management to kind of wrap their head around. The project is then included in the pre-approved list on the SEP website and available for contributions from respondents. The folks that we kind of talked about over the first half of the presentation, they could see where the project is in terms of what level of community it's benefiting, and then, of course, they'll be able to see the description of what exactly the project is. The respondent contributes allowable SEP offset amount to third-party administrator within the respondent's community. Like we saw on the map, if it was an air violator, they could contribute all the way up to the air control section. Third-party administrator must have, now this is for the third-party administrator, they must have a separate fee-free and non-interest-bearing bank account for all SEP funds. There can absolutely be no commingling of funds. That includes funding from other sources. So again, this is where Bryony would kind of chime in as she would be the tracker, but it's really important, as in most cases, there's going to be other sources of funding for the project that you're doing. It won't just be C-SEP funds that are coming in. In many cases, and for good reason, the projects that third parties are looking to do, this money from C-SEP funding is going to be only a portion of the funding that they hope to get in order to implement the design of their project. And so if you have other funding sources, say for the water quality stuff, you're going to have funding from CDBG, but maybe you have supplemental funding from C-SEP funds. Those need to be in separate accounts, I would imagine, although I can't speak for sure, but I'd imagine the CDBG portion of them, that is a grant program. We're not, but I'm sure they have accounting practices that also require that any money that they dish out go to a separate account. But for our purposes, only C-SEP funds go into that account, and that's for accounting purposes on the back end. It makes it easier when you get those quarterly reports. And you must pay the vendors from the C-SEP bank account directly. Third-party administrator performs the C-SEP and reports quarterly to the TCEQ. From the respondent's perspective, all they do once they decide to do a third-party C-SEP, they pay their portion of to the general revenue, and then the second portion they they don't send it to us, at least they're not supposed to. It goes directly to the third-party administrator of their choice. And then they from their perspective, they've kind of done their part, even though the money might not be spent for quite some time. The TCEQ considers the respondent kind of done. So the third party never has to knock on their door and say, hey, where's this funding coming from, or where's the next payment? That they have to pay the entirety. We can do payment plans for the general revenue portion, but we do require respondents to pay in full the third-party portion for good reason, because we don't want third-party administrators to be collectors. So a third-party quarterly report identifies whether C-SEP contributions have been received, whether C-SEP funds have been spent timely, within 1 year, reasonable extensions are available. Of course, this is all predicated on the nature of the project. So there might be 1 year renewable in which they're still receiving funds in order to reach the first threshold, the milestone, in order to do, say, the first phase of whatever their project is. So, it's not like, oh, you have 365 days to spend the money or else. It's just we want to make sure that as you're accumulating the funds, that if there's a project, portion of the project that can be used, funding can be used on, that should be used on, so that it's not just money that's kind of just sitting around collecting dust. Because otherwise, that money would normally go to the general revenue fund, but for the fact that respondent chose the third-party project. That's usually not too much of a trouble, as long as proper reporting and on the front end, when we have that potential third-party administrator, there's going to be a budget item on there. So we work out the budget ahead of time so that there's no confusion as to what can and can't be the C-SEP funds be spent on. You verify the C-SEP funds are not being commingled with non-C-SEP funds, and you just want to make sure that if there are extension requests, that those are timely submitted to your C-SEP coordinator. The documentation required you can see there, but I mean, honestly, that information is going to be project specific. Some of them are very, very common almost across the board, like invoices for allowable costs and paid receipts and photographs and things of that nature, not unlike a respondent side C-SEP would have in terms of tracking purpose, but those are all spelled out also in the contract, so that's the required documentation that the third-party administrator needs to retain, and then come quarterly report time to submit to the TCEQ for review. That's not a mystery. We get all that out before the third-party administrator's project is approved, along with the budget, so that there's no confusion. That wasn't always the case. I know many, many, many years ago, there wasn't even a budget. That was a real boon to both the TCEQ and the third-party administrator side, where everything's spelled out on the front end so that there's no real questions as to what the responsibilities are. and what the budget allows for. These are types of allowable expenses: supplies, materials, equipment, and contracted labor. Second part is very important. Types of allowable administrative costs is up to and including 10% of the direct cost of the project is allowed for administrative costs. And these are some of the examples: salary and fringe benefits, travel and per diem, and overhead costs. The thing to note here is if there's a projected administrative costs that, let's say, for instance, it fits like salary in some of those categories, those need to be detailed as itemized and itemized in the proposed budget. If it's not in the budget, even if it's an otherwise allowable administrative cost in terms of those categories, it can't be used for that purpose. So I always encourage, if you foresee administrative costs, include that in the budget for us to review and approve, so that you don't get into a scenario in which, or you get into a scenario in which you have it in your budget, but you're overly specific as to its use. So you say, pay for salary for project manager at $40,000 a year, but you say project manager is a specific person or specific title only, and then you realize 2 years later that, oh, now the job functions that used to fall under this person or under this title is now, it's the same amount of money, but it's now a different person, or it's now shared as between two different positions. You can amend the budget and get an amended project going, and that's not unusual, but that is downtime you could otherwise potentially avoid if you make the expense specific, but not necessarily tied to a specific person. And it obviously depends on the type of project, but we try and work with third-party administrators so that we try and give as much flexibility as possible while still having everything pretty clear. So these are some of the current third-party administrators. If your favorite third-party administrator is not on the list, I apologize in advance. We do have some of the heavy hitters, Texas Association of RC&Ds statewide. Some of these are statewide, some of them are regional, but we do have very good partners who also, especially for some of these on this list, who also give really good information. If you're trying to just get, hey, give me the rundown on TCQ-SEPs from the third-party administrator's perspective, some of these folks be more than happy to kind of tell you their experience and give you a little bit of information for how that goes. You could always follow the link once you have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation for third-party administrator SEPs for the complete list. Obviously, these are being updated regularly as we get new approved projects added to the list. So here's some pictures from some of the projects that have been conducted through the third-party administrator SEP program. Unfortunately, I don't have any specific information to give on these, but they do have information on the website in terms of the projects and on their specific websites, not just ours. Now, here's some financial information. These are total administrative orders for 2018 and 2019. This is important in the sense that these are total administrative orders, although not only a fraction of these would have potentially supplemental one of our project attached to the agreed order. For better or worse, a lot of administrative orders or agreed orders are entered into without entering into a SEP type of thing, whether it be a compliance, well, usually a compliance SEP or a third-party administrator SEP. So if you look at this one, this gives you the idea of what I'm talking about. This is really, really one of the most important slides from the third-party administrators, a prospective third-party administrator's perspective, especially if they're thinking what, like the scope of their proposed project and how much they anticipate additional funding outside of the SEP, potential SEP funding would be, because between 3.9 and 2.7, that's about where we are year over year, certainly over the last several years in terms of SEP funding in comparison to the total penalties assessed from the previous slide with the orders. That disparity grew, if you recall from earlier, because compliance SEPs, now that the local governments can choose to do compliance SEPs, that's 100% of the funding that at least almost half of it would have otherwise potentially gone to a third-party administrator is now going to a city or an LG who is using it to fix their own problems. Again, it's helpful. I do understand why, it is less burdensome on the local tax base, and it is helpful to the communities, and it does encourage a quick settlement and return to the RTC, return to compliance on behalf of the respondents. But on the flip side, there has been a decrease in funding that would otherwise might have gone to third parties that the LGs might have chosen instead of doing a compliance SEP. So if you have a projected project with an estimated budget of 18 million, of which you anticipate or hope to have 18 million of that be supplemental in a project funded, fully funded, I would project it wouldn't be done in our lifetimes. Let's just put it that way. So here's the contact information. That is my direct line, 0630. That is actually my direct line, in case you're wondering. The current SEP coordinator, there's usually two, and we will be getting a second one again. There's a SEP coordinator, Betty Sanders. That's her number and contact information. If you have questions for the SEP coordinator, if you have questions about third-party administrator, proposed projects, or contracting, or if you're trying to submit or have questions about submitting an application for third party, I would be the appropriate contact person. Stuart Beckley he's on the enforcement division. In the enforcement division, he mostly handles respondent side queries. His information's on there available as well. And of course, we encourage you to submit questions to Hannah for her to kind of collate, and then she'll be getting those back to us. And that's what I have. I hope that was helpful. And if there's any questions or comments, please make sure to forward those to Hannah. And I just want to, again, extend a warm thanks to Hannah Allen for organizing the event. And again, my apologies for having to carry the weight that otherwise have been a two-person job. So hopefully I was able to do it with at least some degree of satisfaction to the folks who were looking for some information.
Ryan, we really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to present this information to us. It was extremely helpful for COG staff to learn, and we hope that it was beneficial to everyone else that's on the webinar as well. But thank you again to everyone who joined us today. We really appreciate all of your time. And with that, we'll adjourn.